I just wanted to qualify something before I launch into what often is, in my part, a not very sensitively delivered sermon. We're going to be touching on the issue of divorce and marriage today. And I just wanted to say before I start my exposition that this has nothing to do with any individual. And it has nothing to do at all with a situation that any of us here or watching on the tape may find themselves in. What it is relating to is an application for those who are elders or in the ministry. Okay, and again, it doesn't talk about anyone in the past that has had any connection at all to us. So please, if I don't want anyone to feel embarrassed or uncomfortable in what I'm about to say in my application, okay? But brothers and sisters, we do find ourselves here in this church in an interesting situation, don't we? It's interesting because we have been without a pastor of our own for nigh on 2 years, which is a long time, isn't it? It's COVID hasn't helped, has it? You know, it's difficult to line up a guy to come and preach for a call when he can't even get to an airport. But it's an unusual situation we're in. And for all of our prayers and all of the wonderful efforts of the people on the selection committee, we still simply do not know, do we, when the Lord will make his will clear to us to the extent that we'll have a full-time minister of our own in this pulpit. We trust and we pray, but we just don't know. And we have had some disappointments, and on the back of that, I feel convicted that now is the right time for us to consider what it is that we should be looking for in a minister. And some of those qualities that we should be seeking out are to be found in what my wife read to us a few minutes ago from Titus chapter 1. What we read from 1 Samuel earlier, whilst very informative and wonderful, and wish I did have time to preach on that, gives us a very helpful picture, but we just don't have time to discuss it this morning. Now, our passage starts with the command from Paul in verse 5 to Titus, who finds himself on that Mediterranean island of Crete, and he's part of the establishing of the churches there. And Paul says to him, look, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. But before I go on, I want to say another thing by way of qualification, and that is I want to go on record as saying that I'm not here this morning to lecture the people on the selection committee. Okay, I asked permission from my fellow elders before I got up here today, and I assured them that I wasn't going to have a go at anyone, especially the noble efforts of the selection committee. The lessons from our passage in Titus chapter 1 today are for all of us, me included, and are to help us to understand the Lord's desire for the purity and the building up of his church. And therefore my prayer is that we shall all gain insight into what God's word has to say, which will help us to listen in an informed manner and then decide wisely when evaluating any man who would come here to preach for a call. So I've said that's my prayer, so let's pray before we continue. Our Lord, we thank you that we do have this here for us to guide us, Lord, as to what you would have us look out for when we do consider a man who comes to preach for a call. So, Lord, we do pray for your blessing now for the activity of your Holy Spirit to give anointing to me as I speak and to every one of us here as we hear the word. Amen. So we only really have time, for all that Jaslyn read to us a minute ago, we only really have time this morning to consider in detail the parts of Titus chapter 1 which deal with the private life of the elder or minister. And when I say private life, I mean the very private life being his family life. And so we'll just have 2 points from our sermon today. The first is the minister's marriage, and the second is the minister's children. Now you'll notice that in our passage from Titus, Paul uses 2 words, elder and overseer. Now we shall go along with that, of course we should go along with that, but we should note that while he uses these 2 different words, elder and overseer, he actually ascribes the same qualities and tasks to them both. And because we have a specific issue, friends, to address in our own congregation, we're going to look at this from the point of view of a certain role of elder or overseer, which we commonly call a pastor or a minister. Now, this is not only because I'm limited in how much time and scope I have here this morning, but there's a scriptural warrant for me to do this. It says in 1 Timothy 5, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honour, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. So we have a distinction made here between your regular run-of-the-mill elders, which some churches call ruling elders, and that certain type of elder called a teaching elder. And these are the men who are set apart for a teaching and preaching role in the church. And we call men that are so set apart, we call them ordained ministers, don't we? This sounds a bit like Presbyterianism 101, doesn't it? But let's get on to our first point, the minister's marriage. Now, normally in the church, when there's a matter of marital problems or even immorality, we try to deal with it as quietly and as privately as possible. But when it comes to elders in the church, and by this we're chiefly thinking in terms of the pastor or the minister, such a protection of their privacy cannot always occur. And this is because the minister, by virtue of his role in the church, is subject to much more public scrutiny. So let's look at it in verse 6. Verse 6 is our chief verse for this morning. Paul writes, an elder must be blameless, the husband of but one wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild or disobedient. Now, if I did have the time, I would like to have read to you from 1 Timothy chapter 3, where the lists of qualifications for an elder run very similar to what we have here in Titus, but with some significant variations. And perhaps another time we could look at that in detail. But there, as here in Titus chapter 1, we find the same word, that word blameless. An elder must be blameless, says Paul. And again, we'll narrow our focus onto the life witness of a teaching elder or a minister, just to help us in our current situation. Now, blameless, we need to not go overboard here. By blameless, it does not mean without sin. All right? It does not mean without sin. That is the point of the mercy and the grace of God that Paul keeps referring to throughout this whole letter to Titus. A minister, of course, is a man who is a sinner, but who has the grace of God, which enables him to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, which Titus chapter 2 teaches. But to be blameless, friends, means to be beyond reproach. It means to uphold a high moral standard in behaviour, and certainly that should occur in daily life. To have nothing that anyone could readily use against him for a scandal, or to discredit his character, or to damage his ministry. And then Paul narrows the focus to the family life of the minister for this blamelessness. It's in the way he upholds his marriage that we find the first test. The husband of one wife, a one-woman man. Now, there's been debate over the years about whether this means polygamy, so the minister should not be married to more than one lady at a time, or whether it means men who are divorced and remarriage. But a lot of that debate misses the point of Paul's writing here. Polygamy is already gotten rid of in the New Testament anyway, but what it really means, it's what it's really about, friends. is about faithfulness in marriage. Now, Paul is certainly giving this command to Titus in the context of a culture which, while it formally, in a formal sense, prohibited polygamy, it was known for being very licentious. The Greek people were very loose in their morals in many ways. Many a man would have a girl on the side. On the island of Crete, they worshipped the god Dionysius. And the worship of Dionysius involved many acts that were immoral, including the wrongful intimate relations. So even if not formally recognised as having more than one wife, a man in Greek culture, unfortunately, including guys coming to the church, would often practically have more than one woman whom he did things with, who he should only do with a wife, be it a girlfriend on the side or his dalliance at the Dionysian parties. And Paul says that an elder is not to be that sort of a guy. Note that this verse does not exclude men who are single. A man who is single cannot be a husband of but one wife, can he? Not men who doesn't exclude men who are widowers but have remarried, nor does it exclude men who are divorced due to infidelity of their first wife and then have later remarried. But the crunch for the question comes, doesn't it? With a man who is divorced and remarried, wherein the man who divorced his wife did so because he fell out of love with her or because he found someone else while still married. And that's condemned by God. You can see that for yourself if you read Malachi 2. The Lord even says that he hates that sort of thing. And we cannot think that it's okay now, especially when the role of a minister is to speak the word of God into the lives of his flock. Now, does this mean, friends, that a man who was foolish in his younger years be banned from the ministry, even if he has now perhaps even decades of faithful service to God? Well, let's just say, at least, that it does require a careful examination of that man if he aims to be a minister in the church. But as I've already hinted, the real point of what Paul is saying here in verse 6 of Titus 1 is that the elder or minister is to be a one-woman man. He is to be faithful to his wife. And this should come as no surprise, should it? We're told elsewhere in Ephesians 5 that husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This means that the man's role in marriage, is not merely a case of, buy her flowers and keep her happy. Although flowers don't go astray normally in marriage, I've found. Rather, friends, it has a gospel basis. Christ died for his beloved bride, the church, to rescue her and all of the people who are part of her from her sins, to purify her, to make her his very own beloved, cherished bride forever. And a man who is unfaithful to his wife, or has his affections divided between two women, or whose eyes keep wandering after, pretty women, is not reflecting that gospel-based love which should be given alone to his wife. You see, marriage is the primary relationship between two human beings. It is based on the way that God made us, and, as Ephesians 5 just told us, it is based on the relationship between Christ and his church. And this love is pure, and it is holy, and it is unbreakable, and it cannot be dissolved. And where an elder or a minister would fail to reflect that love in the way he treats his wife, or where he would go against that love by being unfaithful, or simply calling the whole thing off, because the honeymoon is over, then such a man is not blameless. He is instead blameworthy. And he has no place in the ministry, and he has no place in teaching the scriptures to God's people. And he cannot be a shepherd to guide God's people to fidelity if he has none himself. Now, there's much for us to take away from this part of the verse by application. Now, one of the beautiful things about being in a Presbyterian church is that no congregation can be forced to have a minister over it that it doesn't want. That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? There's lots of other churches where if the bishop says this is what you're getting, this is what you're getting, or if someone who sort of holds sway says this is the way it is, you can't question it. But all the members here get to vote. Each of us can look at a man's life, and if he does not measure up what Paul has taught to Titus here, then we can ask questions and we can even vote against him, cast our vote against him becoming a minister here. But we need grace, don't we, as we consider this. You see, if we get a guy come here to preach for a call and his wife accompanies him, how are we going to deal with them? Well, we can start out by looking at the way he speaks to his wife. Does he seem kind and respectful? Is he gentle? Because any minister who treats his wife as if she is anything but the most important person in the world to him is not worthy of drawing a salary from our tithes and offerings. But at the same time, we need not expect everything to be smooth for the minister we may be interested in. It could be that he and his wife are tired and weary from travelling to visit us. It could be that one of them's unwell. It could be that there's anxiety on their behalf. It could be that one of them is very keen to come here, but the other is not. And so there's tension between them even before they walk through the doors. And so we need to be discerning, don't we, friends? It's no use us sitting up like hawks ready to swoop down on every stray word. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I'm not here to lecture the selection committee, but we can't get around the fact that while these considerations apply to all of us, they do apply in a very immediate sense to those of us here, which is a significant portion of the number here, by the way, but those who are on the selection committee. Very immediate sense. So there's no harm. In fact, it's a good thing for our people on the committee to make inquiries as to how a prospective minister treats his wife, about whether there's anything in his background which would suggest that he has been unfaithful to her, to ask if he has any patterns of behaviour which indicate that he's not a one-woman man. Because, friends, we need a man who is blameless as a husband if he is to be effective as a minister. Well, our second idea concerns, of course, the minister's children. That's that other part of family life, the minister's children. A minister's children must be a source of, must not be a source of blameworthiness for him. And Paul lays out here two very clear criteria for the children of the elder. They are, firstly, this is just the back half of verse 6, that the children must believe. And secondly, that they be not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. And the initial question we must ask is, what does Paul mean by children? The word in the original language generally refers to children who are at home, so younger end of the spectrum here. It does not really talk about adult children who are grown up and out of dad's direct control. And this is talking, just as for marriage, about what goes on in the minister's own household. And the importance of this is probably greater than our society would at first recognise. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul remarks that if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? In our society, we do something a bit silly. We often think of ministers as professionals. In fact, a lot of ministers tend to think of themselves as professionals. But this is simply not the case. A minister can conduct himself in a professional manner, but a minister is not a professional. You see, you might go to a dentist who eats too many sugary snacks. I'm not looking at any dentists here, but you might go to a dentist who's telling you, stop eating so much sugar, but you know that that dentist is a bit of a sugar addict. Or you might go to a heart specialist who is physically very unfit. Or you might have an accountant who is drowning in credit card debt. But just because they have those inconsistencies does not necessarily mean that they're no good in their professional roles. You can rely on them as a professional just the same, even if they don't live it out. With the minister of the word, however, if his family life does not reflect a properly ordered godliness, then he is not to be trusted with handling the family of God, which is the church. Now, as for children, any given child will bring a fresh set of challenges to his or her parents, won't they? And some children bring more challenges than others. There are different temperaments, there are different paces of development, there are physical and intellectual impairments and disorders and limitations which we have to consider. And there are, of course, very sadly, traumatic events in the life of a child which can shake things up as well. But the children at home of a minister should be believers. Now, of course, it is only the Lord who can save anyone, and that includes children. To make someone a believer involves a work of the Holy Spirit. There's no other way. It involves a work of regeneration in the heart of any person. And thankfully, in God's big plan, this can occur in children from a very early age, so that in many cases, children can't remember a time before they believed. Sometimes children have a time when they consciously undergo a conversion, when they change from not knowing the Lord and walking with him to knowing him and trusting in him. But the Lord, in his sovereignty, is pleased to usually make use of means to bring the gospel message to someone and to help it to sink home. And the chief means that God uses for a child is his parents, his or her mum and dad. And mothers are absolutely crucial in that role. We know Timothy, don't we, in the Bible? Was his mother and his grandmother godly women who trained him up and taught him the faith. Absolutely vital. But for the most part, the buck stops with the father. It is the father who has overall responsibility to teach his children the word of God. Now, this in no way limits the mother, friends. If her husband is a faithful man of God, then rather than being limited by him, she will be at liberty to teach the children from the Bible. She will be enabled by him to do so every day. And then we see come into play that famous proverb, don't we? Train a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. And the job of a minister at church is essentially the same job that he has as a father to his children, to present Christ to them as the crucified and risen Saviour. And later in this letter, in chapter 2, I've already referred to it, Paul speaks of the grace of God which has appeared unto all people, which teaches us to behave in a self-controlled way, living godly and upright lives. And that is the underlying truth which should steer the life of even the most rambunctious child to being obedient and growing in the faith. And the minister's role is to impart that fundamental truth to his children, as well as to his congregation. That's what a minister should do. Now, there's no stipulation in this verse about the level of knowledge that a child should have. It simply says that they should be believers. Now, they need not be, scholars of Hebrew and Greek. They just have to be believers. They have to believe the core message of the gospel as best as they can understand it at their stage of development. They probably need to know some of those core things, that they have sinned and that Jesus is God the Son, that Jesus came and that he didn't sin. They need to know that God loved them so much that he sent Jesus to die on the cross to take the punishment for their sins. A very, very young child can understand that. I'm very blessed to say that my children understood that at a very young age. That Jesus rose from the dead, that he really came back to life. The child needs to understand that so that they have life in him. And they need to understand that Jesus is the King, then that he's the King forever. And if they believe that, that will show in their general behaviour. Now, even the most thoroughly converted person of any age will slip up and at times will fall into sin. But the general pattern of behaviour for a child, as for an adult, who has faith in Jesus will be one which reflects that faith. And the verse here, of course, refers to children in the plural, not to an individual child. So Paul is looking again generally at a family as children as a lot and their faith and behaviour. But genuine faith is hard to pick out, isn't it, in children who are wild, as Paul says here in verse 6. Now, the word for wild in the original language means inability to save. That is to say, they seem like they are in an unsaved state, and they actually represent a wastefulness. Now, this sort of thing, friends, goes far beyond, the rowdiness of a toddler or the cheekiness and the occasional naughtiness of the young child. It even goes far beyond the snootiness of a teenager. We're talking here about youngsters who act as those in whom the Holy Spirit has not done a work of bringing new life. And verse 6 goes on to say that the children are not to be open to the charge of disobedience. This means that they are not rebellious, they're not rejecting rule. Again, this is not the same. Okay, it's not the same as children who are a bit rowdy or, kids who get overexcited, which is probably most children. This is about them not obeying authority in their lives. In short, what Paul is telling Titus here is that the man with the best news of all should have nothing in himself or in his private life which would detract from conveying that good news to everyone around him. That's what he's saying. And the application arises readily here for this second point, friends. And that is that we need to be wise when we observe the children of any prospective minister. Yes, we should expect them to be children who believe, but if they're very young, what if they're 3 years old? What are we to expect of them precisely? Or perhaps more realistically in such a case, we could expect them simply to be listening to mummy and daddy when they tell them stories about Jesus, shouldn't we? And we need to take into consideration that in any given family, some children come along more quickly, others come along more slowly than others, and that there are a lot of legitimate reasons why children can be a real handful. It's similar with a pastor who comes with teenagers or even tweenagers. I think that's 8 to 12, tweenagers. Sometimes a reluctant grunt is all we can expect when we greet a teenage boy or girl. But that doesn't mean, does it, that the Lord's not doing a wonderful work in them. There's no doubt that we need to be looking carefully at the overall pattern of the family life of a minister who would come to us. And if we can bear in mind that everyone, especially children, is a work in progress, then perhaps instead of taking detailed notes on the bad things that a child says or does, we can look to see if the minister is working to correct and to guide his children. But I have to say, there are some red flags which indicate danger. Any man who would think that some published, often faddish parenting technique is sufficient to somehow save a child's soul is a man who has no idea about how the grace of God works and who has no place in teaching the Scriptures. Any man who would shirk his responsibility as a father and entirely outsource the nurture and admonition of his children in the Christian faith also has a huge question mark over his head. Any man that would think that, if I just send my kids to a Christian school, they'll be saved. It's very suspect, isn't it? And again, those of us who are more involved in the investigations could take heed here, but each of us could ask a man when he comes to preach and watch a man what it is he does to train his own children in the faith. Does he read the Bible with them and pray with them every day? Does he correct them when they go wrong? Does he teach them the core doctrines of the faith? But friends, as I finish, there is another side to this coin, and that is our role in supporting a minister and his wife and his children. one of the true blessings that we can receive in the church, and this is certainly what we're praying for, is not only a minister who's a good preacher, but a minister who is caring and competent and hardworking. And when the Lord does, because we do trust that the Lord will make this happen, when he comes and he does serve us, and as we grow in maturity under his ministry, let us all realise, friends, that we have a responsibility to make sure that he has enough time in his life to be able to be that husband and father that he needs to be so that he can remain blameless. Let us realise that we need to let him say no to things. It means that we can help him remain blameless in regard to his personal life. Let's ask God's blessing. Our Father, we thank you for what we've just considered. And Lord, while some of it is difficult, some of it requires a lot of wisdom and discernment. Lord, we thank you and trust in you that you will provide. And Lord, we ask that at your timing, Lord, that you'll send to us a man who is blameless, who is an excellent husband and an excellent and godly father, and that in turn will be an excellent under-shepherd of Christ to us. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, friends,